I want to ask you a few questions, and I want you to really sit with them before you keep watching. When you get critical feedback at work, what happens to your body? Does something tighten? Does your face get hot? Do you immediately start building a case for why they're wrong? When you're in a room full of senior people, who do you become? Do you get quieter? Or do you start performing? Do you shrink? Do you over-explain? When something goes on a project, what is your first instinct? Is it to fix it? Is it to figure out who's accountable? Or to make sure you're in no way at fault? Or at least make sure that no one figures out that you're at fault? And this is the last one. When you imagine the version of yourself that you want to be in your career, the leader you want to be, what's the gap between that person and the person who showed up today? If any of those questions landed somewhere uncomfortable, good. That discomfort is important. That discomfort is actually the beginning of the most important professional skill you will ever develop. We talk a lot about self-awareness in career development. Know your weaknesses, know your strengths, get some feedback, reflect on it. And all of that is fine as far as it goes. But there's a version of self-awareness that goes so much deeper than that. It is so much more uncomfortable, but it's also so much more transformative than anything you'll get back from a yearly review, some project critical feedback, or a 360 assessment. And you might have heard me talk about this before, but I like to call it radical self-awareness. It is the single most important professional skill that I have ever developed. More than any leadership training or communication improvement. Because honestly, without radical self-awareness, none of that would work. None of that actually functions at its full potential. Radical self-awareness isn't about getting to know your strengths or your weaknesses at work. It's about understanding the emotional and behavioral patterns that are running your career, often without your knowledge and often completely automatically. It's the kind of self-awareness that doesn't just ask, what did I do? But why did I do it? Not just what happened in that meeting and how did I react, but how did I feel? What were my triggers? Which version of me showed up and why? The funny thing is, it is uncomfortable in a way that high achievers really, really avoid it because it requires to look at parts of yourself that you very likely tried really, really hard to hide, to ignore, to set aside, even from yourself. Developing radical self-awareness is the thing that transformed my career more than anything else. I'm an engineer and I've been in leadership positions in multi-billion-dollar programs around the world. And today I want to break down exactly what it is, what it looks like in practice, and how to start building it. I think of radical self-awareness as having 3 distinct layers. And most people, even the ones that consider themselves quite self-aware, are only operating in that first layer. The first one is behavioral awareness, and this one is the most surface level kind, and it's where most of the career advice lives. It really answers questions like, what do I do when I get stressed? Do I get quiet? Do I overthink? Do I overanalyze? Maybe do I start over talking, over explaining? So this first one is really just that awareness of that behavior. I mean, it's already a really good step. Behavioral awareness is being able to see how you act. The next step is being able to see how you act without judgment, to be able to observe yourself without judgment, without trying to justify yourself, without trying to explain the reason you did what you did. The first step is really to just see the pattern. It still requires you being brave, being able to be honest with yourself to say, yes, I do that. But even that first step of self-awareness is important. Being able to know when you react or when you behave in a certain specific way, being able to see it for yourself is important. I mean, there is a possibility that you aren't even able to see the behavior that you do. For me, there was multiple behaviors I had to get honest about, but there was a lot of low-hanging fruits that I could easily point out. First off, overworking. That was a very easy one that I did. Oversharing was a harder one to notice that I was doing. Or getting defensive. That one was very difficult for me to understand that I was doing that. Because to me, I was just trying to explain a certain situation, but it was coming off as defensiveness. The thing is, though, I had to see the pattern before I could do anything about it. The second layer is emotional awareness. This one is harder, especially for the high achievers who come through the technical analytical fields like I do. For them, it can almost feel impossible at first. Because we're so good at rationalizing everything. I mean, one of the first things I ever heard from my therapist was that I was analyzing my feelings instead of feeling them. So we get so good at explaining our feelings instead of actually feeling them. Emotional awareness is about going underneath the behavior and asking yourself, what did I feel when that happened? What did I feel when I behaved this way? Not what did I think, not what was going through my mind, but what was my body feeling? What was my nervous system feeling? Was it fear? Was it shame? Was it pain coming from some sort of thought process that you're not enough? Maybe it was anger, but maybe it was anger because you were actually trying to cover up hurt. All of this matters because most of the behavior that shows up at work or in our careers are not actually responses to what's happening in the room. They're responses to what we're feeling in our body. And if you can't name the feeling, the emotion, then you can't understand the behavior and you can't change it. I'll give you a personal example. For years, I reacted to critical feedback as being defensive. That was the behavior. I got defensive. But when I actually sat with what was happening in my body and I tried to understand what was happening in my body every time that I received critical feedback, I understood that it wasn't actually anger. It was a lot of fear. It was the fear that maybe I wasn't as good as what I thought that I was, and that others were going to figure out or see through me. And I was afraid that others would see it and think that I actually wasn't good at my job either. But something changed in me because when I thought of giving critical feedback to others who I thought very highly of, I never thought of them as not being good at their job as this critical feedback means that they're a failure. I always admired them no matter what, but providing the small critical feedback to me was something to help them improve. So I had to sit back and really think about why was it different when I received critical feedback? Why was I so terrified about receiving that critical feedback? And once I finally started understanding that, everything started changing for me because I was able to start changing that behavior and that perspective. The third layer and the deepest layer is identity awareness. This is the deepest level, and this is the level that most career conversations never come anywhere near it. Identity awareness is about understanding what version of you shows up in any situation. It's about being able to understand that the reaction that you're having in that moment actually has nothing to do with what's happening in that moment. It likely has a lot more to do with a survival mechanism that your nervous system created to survive something that happened a long time ago. We've all developed these identities to keep ourselves safe. The perfectionist who learned that love was conditional, the people pleaser who learned that conflict was dangerous, the overachiever who learned that their worth was based on their performance, the person who shrinks themselves in any room because they learned that taking up space was dangerous. Those identities are brilliant adaptations. They got you through whatever you needed to get through, but now they're showing up in your career, in your leadership style, in your communication, in your decision making. And they were optimized for a world that no longer exists for you. And until you figure out which one is in the driver's seat at any given moment, you're going to keep reacting from it without even knowing that that's what you're doing. So how do you develop radical self-awareness practically? Because I don't want to just tell you that it matters. I want to give you something that actually helps you develop it. First thing is, I want you to start reviewing your reactions instead of just looking at the result. After a difficult meeting, a hard conversation, or maybe just a moment where you didn't show up as the best version of yourself, the version of yourself that you want to be, I don't want you to just move on. Sit with it for 5 minutes, not to beat yourself up for it, not to try and analyze who was right and who was wrong, but just to observe without judgment. What happened in my body when that started? What was I feeling before I reacted the way that I reacted? Where have I felt it before? The best way to do this is to write it down if you can, because there's something about putting it down on paper that makes it really easy to start recognizing patterns instead of just thinking about them. The next thing you're going to do is to try to start recognizing or identifying your triggers. Try not to be vague about this. Try to be very specific. What exact thing, what specific situation, what particular way of being spoken to activates you, triggers you? Because being able to identify those triggers are going to be your map. They show you exactly where all the unresolved stuff lives. And once you know your triggers, you can stop being surprised by your reactions and you can actually start preparing for them. And the third thing, this one is the most important, and I've said it multiple times already, is to practice observing yourself without judgment. This one is really difficult because most of us have a really harsh inner critic. I mean, our inner voice is much harsher to ourselves than it would be to any other person. And so being able to observe yourselves sometimes instead of being self-reflection turns into self-punishment. You really want to try really hard not to do that. I know for me, when I would notice a pattern, I would immediately go into self-loathing and I would spend so much energy in that self-loathing cycle. And it turns out all that self-hatred is not actually useful for you. Try, and I know this sounds so simple, but try to be as curious about yourself, about understanding yourself, as you would be with another person. I mean, if you were talking to your best friend and she had shut down in a meeting, you wouldn't tell her that she was broken. You wouldn't hate her for it. You would try and understand what was going on. So try to do the same for yourself. Radical self-awareness is not easy. Looking at your own patterns to trace where they come from, and then really trying to understand the emotional depth behind them, that's the real work. It requires a level of courage that I think career conversations completely underestimate. But on the other side of it, there's a version of yourself that you are no longer at war with, where your energy goes into actually leading instead of managing your own reactions, your own humanity, and where opportunities stop feeling like threats and they become what they actually are, yours for the taking. That version of you is not that far away. It starts with being willing to look. Subscribe if you want to keep going on this. Every video in this channel goes deeper into the internal work that actually transforms your career. And if you haven't watched my video on imposter syndrome yet, go watch that next. It goes hand in hand with everything that we've talked about today. I'll see you in the next one. Bye, everyone.